Hello, everyone. This is a recording of the general lecture that we have been giving in the ART110 art module for weeks 2 through 4. This is just a supplement to the conversation that we have in our studio class for those who might want a refresher or just want to sort of see the slides and hear the short description as we go. So I'll be moving through this relatively quickly. Certainly will not be quite as long as the discussion that we have in the studio. Now, the first thing that we are going to talk about has to do with this concept of the figure ground. And when we're talking about the figure ground, we're really talking about the interaction between the things that we use to activate a space and then the resulting areas that are around that space. So for instance, if I have a large empty room and I put a chair in that large empty room, the chair represents the object, and the space that I've now created around that chair is the negative space. Now, if this room is relatively small, then that chair is going to fill the room and create more energy around it in a smaller space. The larger the room is, the chair then takes up less space, and now we're creating less activity in the negative space. Ultimately, what we are trying to achieve with this conversation and with the experiment is to engage in what we call the dichotomy of attention. And the activity offers the simple concept of giving utility to both positive and negative space. In other words, making sure that we are paying attention to both. To give an example on perhaps using audio, let's say we strum a guitar. And as we're strumming that guitar, that will represent the figure, that will represent the active object. The space after that strumming will represent the negative space or the silence. We've also inherently activated the space just prior to the strumming. And so on either side of the active musical note are negative space or silence. That's how two-dimensional design works as well. If I make a brush mark onto a canvas, I have, of course, made a mark, and that is activating that particular space, but I've also introduced two other spaces and all the other space around it on the canvas. So first, let's talk a little bit about the canvas itself. We call that the picture frame. And the picture frame, it can be made up of several different dynamic shapes. As you can see here, I have a horizontal, I have a vertical, I have a square. And two out of the three of these are dynamic in emphasis. The horizontal represents rest. Whether we know it or not, we are perceiving a shape that is inherently at rest in that horizontal. It is laid sideways, and we simply get that sense of peace and horizontal horizontal passiveness. That's not the word rest. Why did I not remember the word rest? There we go. We got the word rest out. On the vertical, however, it gives us just the opposite. It gives us the sense of life. And the reason we get the sense of life is we can relate these to the human form. If something is laying down, we say it is at rest. If something is standing up, we can say it is awake or alive. Now, the square is different than either of those two because it's equal balance on all sides, and therefore we create a harmony within that shape or a perfect balance. And so if we're going to be talking about figure ground and activating a figure ground, the ground would be any of these shapes. The figure would be whatever we put on those shapes. And in order to start out with an even playing field, we'll start off with using the square as our ground. So here you can see I have a square. The black square represents, again, the ground, and the white square represents the figure or the marks that we're going to make. Just imagine that this is maybe a white piece of paper on a black board. And the way that I have it situated right here is where all of the negative space is equal distant from the figure. And so therefore I've created something called passive negative space, where there is a lack of energy between the figure and the ground. That doesn't mean that there is nothing happening here, but what it's creating is a passive negative space, which creates, again, a reiteration of this harmony. Simply by changing the angle of that shape and slightly enlarging it, I'm now creating what's called active negative space. I'm activating the space by creating another shape. As you can see, the turning of that white card, if we want to call it a card, activates the negative space, creating new shapes. In other words, the black area or the ground area is now taking on the form of diagonals. And just like with our conversation earlier about the horizontals being at rest, yes, I remember the word rest, the verticals being alive, the square being harmony, a diagonal intuitively represents energy. And so that is what we have created here. We have activated the space by creating energy, by tilting that just slightly diagonal and bringing that square a little bit closer to the edge. We could take it a step farther by creating what we're going to call dynamic negative space. And dynamic negative space, you can see the difference here, is the shape has enlarged more and now is breaking the plane. It's now breaking the outside edges of our ground space. And therefore, what we're creating are unique shapes. You can see now we have 4 activated triangles. Also, what's happening is our eyes are continuing the square and completing it. We don't see this as if we've cut off the square. We presume that outside of our field of vision is the rest of that square. Now, whether you know it or not, what we've done here is we have brought the viewer in, and they are now participating in this composition because they are the ones who are completing this square shape. Creating tension between 2 objects is really a pretty straightforward idea. Here we have the squares once again. They are now 2 of them, both of them breaking the picture plane. However, the space in between the 2 squares now creates a tension. By bringing them closer together, what we're actually doing is creating an energy between the 2 of them. We are still creating that dynamic movement, and we are still engaging the audience by allowing them to complete those squares. But ultimately, what we're doing is we're creating tension by juxtaposing 2 objects together. Now, we don't just position objects together to create tension, we can also create rhythm with the collection of objects on the picture plane. As you can see here, I have 3 squares, and each of them are separated equally apart from each other. This, again, furthers the idea of bringing the viewer into the composition and having them participate. We can presume, of course, that these squares continue and that they complete, but also the pattern that we've set up here, this rhythm that alternates back and forth from the white shape, an even space in between, another white shape, an even space in between, another white shape. We can presume, and the audience will presume, that this pattern will continue on outside of their field of view in the same manner, on and on and on. This alternating rhythm, this back and forth, is what we call a pattern, and it is creating just that, an alternating rhythm. Now, we can ramp that up and move the eye not just in one direction or the other, but in a particular direction. In this case, we are creating what's called a progressive rhythm. And a progressive rhythm, much like an alternating rhythm, is a pattern. However, this pattern is changing over time. And as you can see, as our eye moves from the left side, there's tension being created there. There's less tension in the second one, less tension in the third one. That's because the spaces are getting farther and farther apart. Again, the audience is going to then gather that as this pattern continues, the squares will continue to get farther apart as you move to the right and continue to get closer together as you move to the left. We can also introduce a concept of weight. So not only is my eye moving now in one direction or the other specifically because of the progressive rhythm, but also I am shifting the energy of the composition down to the lower part, which creates more weight, which makes it feel like a heavier composition. If I flip back to the other slide here, you can see this just feels balanced because it is neither to the bottom or to the top. But now what happens is there's a pulling down of this composition, and that is a visual weight that we can create. Next, we'll talk about proportion. And proportion, of course, has something to do with big objects next to little objects and so on. But in our case, what we want to talk about is really more about the relationship of those shapes. So when we're talking about proportion, we're saying what next to it, one thing next to another establishes the proportional relationship. Let's just say, for example, that I, as an adult, am standing next to a 5-year-old. That 5-year-old will be perceived as being small as compared to myself. I would be big, the 5-year-old would be small. Now, if we take that same 5-year-old and put an infant next to the 5-year-old, now the 5-year-old is perceived as large and the infant is perceived as small. And so you see, it's not really about the actual scale, it's about the relationships within the composition or within the scale that we're talking about. So in this example, we have the 3 objects. We have one that is being perceived as large, one as medium, and one as small. But if we were to remove the large square there at the bottom, the square at the top would be considered large, not medium. Now, taking this again another step farther, we can talk about the relationship, but we can also talk about the actual physical dimensions. Let's just say, for instance, that the square at the top there measures 4 inches. The square next to it, the smaller one, then if we're talking about proportion, would logically be measured 2 inches, and therefore we're creating this 50% or 200% relationship. The square on the bottom then, if we were to use a measurement of 8 inches on that square, again, we are escalating in an equal way, and they're automatically going to have something to do with one another. Now, with the project that we're going to be working on, there will be 2 concepts that we deal with. One, symmetry, and the other, asymmetry. Let's talk about symmetry first. As you can see here, in this example, it's a very simple concept. What happens on one side of a composition happens equally on the other side of the composition. That's it. If it happens on one side, it happens equally on the other side. Now, we can be thinking in the other direction as well. If we were to add another shape up to the top, it would be happening equally at the bottom. That creates symmetry. Asymmetry, on the other hand, is even more straightforward to describe. It is simply not symmetry. Anything that is not symmetry, by default, is asymmetry. And as you can see here, I've shifted the weight of that interior square to the right. And therefore, I have created an asymmetrical, albeit balance, because it is not shifted over so far that is creating an extraordinary weight. And so therefore, this becomes asymmetry. Now, there are more exaggerated versions of asymmetry, but in either case, we are trying to achieve a balance, albeit not asymmetrical balance. Now, I've included here some real-world examples of composing using photography. And this would be an example of creating a rhythm and creating a balance between the positive and negative space. Is it the water that's the positive space, or is it the snow that is the positive space? Does it really matter? What we're doing here is activating the space, engaging the edges, and utilizing shape to create a visual rhythm. As you can see here, we're not even really using objects. This is a result of light. Shadows, lights, darks, creating a pattern, of course, but the interaction and the engagement of the outer edges create a dynamic composition. Diagonals, lines, created by these palm fronds, again created an incredibly dynamic and active space, once again engaging the entire picture plane. All the edges of the image are being addressed. Here we have an active space using diagonals. Here we have another active space using diagonals, albeit very simple. This image is just dying out for some type there on the right side. However, it is a very simple composition broken up by the figure who is sort of on the vertical, which sort of pacifies some of that diagonal energy. Even using something like circles, as you can see here, we're engaging the entire picture plane. All the edges are addressed. We're not isolating any shape toward the center. Even the figure is activating that and breaking up that half circle down toward the bottom. The fog and the negative space back in the back are being equally used to create a harmony. Alternating rhythm, it's not just squares. This can be back and forth between trees. We can presume that these trees will continue to go along with the pattern of these power lines. A progressive rhythm, activating the space, leads our eye right down the staircase. This is done through the use of that progressive rhythm, an escalating, or in this case, a descending rhythm as the shapes of those objects are getting thinner and thinner and thinner as they go. So our project is going to be a very actually traditional project called the expansion of the square. It's drawing upon the traditions of what we call Notan, which means light dark. And what we're going to be doing is starting off with a square. Just like in the examples above, we'll have a square on a space, negative space. We then will be cutting shapes out of that square and folding them out like a book. Flipping them out. Nothing gets thrown away in this exercise. I'll have a short video which will demonstrate just exactly how this is constructed, but for time's sake, we'll wait for that. As you can see here, these are using more organic shapes, still an attempt at symmetry, because what is happening on one side is happening equally on the other side. However, we are still getting quite a bit of dynamic movement. Again, symmetrical balance, as you can see here, this one is done very carefully. And the latent square, the original square there, is actually turned on the diagonal, as you can still see that image of the original square. Now here we're retreating to image a little bit, and I say that only because it's not necessary that this exercise be a picture of something. In this case, it's representing flowers, and that is what the audience sees. It's not necessary to this project, but I think this particular example is quite effective, this being an asymmetrical balance. Again, we have symmetry. This is very complex, and you see that the maker here had a little bit of trouble with the craft. You see a little cut marks here and there. But overall, with the complexity of this, it's done very well. Again, that square, instead of being set equally in the composition, it is set diagonally in the composition. Again, imagery, but I thought this would be a good example to talk about how the objects are going to be folded out. As you can see on the right there with the tree, it's only half a tree that has been cut out of the square shape. That half a tree is then folded out as if it was on a spine, just sort of folded out. And that is where the rest of the tree is being created. As you can see, nothing is thrown away. It is simply cut out, folded out on its axis, and then glued onto the surface. You can see the same happening to complete the cloud shape on the left, and then the water representational shapes on the left as well. So how is this project going to be done? Well, those of you that join me in class, you'll note that we are going to start by doing thumbnails. And the thumbnails will tell us just exactly what composition to make. In this short video, the woman is going to be describing how to do the construct, and she is going to be drawing directly onto the square. What I want you to do is consider that prior to this demonstration, that she would have drawn out a lot of different designs and decided just exactly what shapes was going to go onto that square before she began just randomly drawing. That she would have decided just exactly how detailed and where the shapes were going to go prior to that. But this demonstration, this short video, should give you an idea of the process of how this is going to come together.
In this short video, I'm going to demonstrate the expansion of the square exercise, which is a Notan exercise designed to study the interaction between positive and negative space. In order for this exercise to be completed successfully, there has to be a feeling of balance created by the design. To begin, you're going to need a small square of black paper. Mine is cut 4 inches by 4 inches, white paper, scissors, a pencil, and a glue stick. Begin by tracing the corners of your black square so that you know where it's going to be eventually glued onto your white paper. Now you're ready to begin drawing shapes, starting and stopping on the straight edges of your square. You can draw symmetrical shapes so that their line of symmetry is through the center of the shape. So for instance, on my heart, I only drew half of the heart along the edge. You can draw an additional shape inside of a shape. This will allow you to create what's called a double cut when you're cutting out your shapes. Your shapes can be organic or geometric, but again, they should start and stop on the edges of your paper so that everything can be cut out of scissors for this exercise. When finished, you're ready to begin cutting. I'm starting by cutting out my heart. You can see I'm cutting on each of my lines very carefully so that I can make the entire cut in just one line. Nothing will be thrown away with this Notan expansion of the square. To expand my square, I'm going to flip my heart backwards so that it opens up like a book. And in this case, since I have a triple cut, I'll put the next piece of the heart back inside and then the third piece back outside the square. Once I have everything lined up, I'm going to glue those pieces of the heart down. As long as I know where to put my square back, since I marked the corners, I can always glue each part as I go. This will make it so much easier so I don't have to keep track of all my little pieces. Now I'm going to speed up and continue on. You can see how I work my way around the entire square, cutting on my lines, flipping the piece cut out like a book, and then if I have a double or triple cut, flipping the next piece back in so that it goes back and forth, out, in, out, in. When I'm all finished, I'll glue down the center square, erase my pencil lines, and then I am done with the exercise. Eventually, much more complicated Notan designs can be created with X-Acto knives and a bit of planning, like the one that we're going to make for our summative project. I hope you enjoy Notan as much as I do. Bye.
Okay, so that is just a summary of the process in which you're going to be assembling the object. But of course, on day 2 of the week, we will be in class going through a brainstorming exercise, which will allow us to create effective designs without having to go through a bunch of material. We'll simply be using paper and pencil, and we'll be creating our Notan designs by drawing them out first, and then arriving at some good ideas, and then expanding upon that, creating more detailed designs. That way, when we begin with the construction of the piece, we already know what it is we're trying to build. It just becomes a matter of craft at that point. So I hope this was helpful. I know that I stumbled over a couple of words there that hopefully you'll know that this is not exactly meant to be a highly produced video, but essentially a sort of a sketch that can serve as a supplement to our in-class discussions. Let me know if you have any questions. You can certainly message or email me, and I'll be happy to respond as soon as I get a chance. All right, thanks so much, and we'll see you in the studio.